So, if you could not tell, our topic, umbrella topic for today's king is about revival. No, that is not the name of the king, but that's just the topic that we're looking at through the eyes of, or I guess through the perspective of the king that we're looking at. So, what does, the classic intro to a new topic, ask what we think it means. I want perspective. What does revival mean? To have revival, to be revived, what does that mean?
To bring back to life.
Bring back to life? Yeah.
Reawakening.
Reawakening? Yeah. Anything else? So because this is what you do, this is just what you do with things like this, I found it on Webster's dictionary, 3 different definitions of revival. The first one is renewed attention to or interest in something, a new presentation or publication of something old, or a restoration of force, validity, or effect as to a contract, some sort of legal document. So what I'm saying with these 3 different definitions is revitalizing something, renewing something, taking something that was old, maybe worn out, maybe something that wasn't working super well, and then making it new or giving it new strength, giving it new force, making it work better or something. So what does revival imply? Well, it implies that something or someone isn't healthy. Maybe you need some sort of physical revival. Maybe you look at yourself in the mirror and go, nope. And you decide maybe I need to make a couple changes. Or maybe you go visit the doctor and you get some news that you're not happy about, but maybe it's something that's in your control as long as you adjust a few things in life. So maybe it implies that you need a little bit of revival in that area. Again, it could imply that there needs to be some change of some sort. Again, maybe you haven't been as focused, I think of people who are still in school. Maybe there needs to be a change in how you approach schoolwork, a revival of some sorts in your study methods. But a revival in general implies that something is one way and we're not satisfied with it. Something isn't working, so we need to go about it a different way, do something different. So today, we'll be looking at the importance of personal but also constant revival. Something that starts with us but continues throughout our lives. Okay, so our text today is 2 Chronicles 29. We'll be looking at King Hezekiah. King Hezekiah. So 2 Chronicles 29 will be our main text. So a little bit of background. The background for Hezekiah can be found in chapter 28. We're not going to really read anything in 28. So King Hezekiah, well, before he was king, his father was King Ahaz, who was not a fantastic individual by any means. Does anybody know what King Ahaz's deal was? What made King Ahaz such an unsavory guy? What did he do to the temple? What did he instate?
Idol worship.
Yep, idol worship.
I think he nailed off the doors.
Yep. So he introduced idol worship alongside the worship of God and closed the doors of the temple.
Child sacrifice.
Yes, never great. Child sacrifice is never good. Never a good thing. So not at all a good guy. And this brings all sorts of problems. If you're looking at the latter half of chapter 28, 16 and following, yeah. All sorts of problems. Armies surround Judah basically on all sides, and especially from the north, from Assyria. And the Assyrians, this is historical too, not just according to Scripture. but secular history will reveal to us that the Syrians were brutal people. I mean, just very, very barbaric in terms of warfare and things like that. So all around, it's not great, Bob. I mean, just not fantastic at all. What Hezekiah or Ahaz is doing, just not at all fantastic. But then we get to old Hezekiah. So he has to take over for all of that. He becomes king at 25 years old. So that is just, if we're starting at chapter 29, that is just a little bit younger than I am, and I could not imagine becoming a king at that age. Just, I could not. And quite honestly, I mean, we get almost immediately we get a really positive light, or we get a really positive interpretation of who Hezekiah is. So let's real quickly, read chapter 29. Let's do verses. I was going to do a little earlier, but I'll just stick with what I have. Verses 3 through 11. Can I get somebody to take that for me?
In the first year of his reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of the Lord's temple and repaired them. Then he brought in the priests and Levites and gathered them in the eastern public square. He said to them, "Hear me, Levites. Consecrate yourselves now and consecrate the temple of the Lord, the God of your ancestors. Remove everything impure from the holy place. For our fathers were unfaithful and did what is evil in the sight of the Lord our God. They abandoned him, turned their faces away from the Lord's dwelling place, and turned their backs on him. They also closed the doors of the portico, extinguished the lamps, did not burn incense, and did not offer burnt offerings in the holy place of the God of Israel. Therefore the wrath of the Lord was on Judah and Jerusalem. And he made them an object of terror, horror, and mockery, as you see with your own eyes. Our fathers fell by the sword, and our sons, our daughters, and our wives are in captivity because of this. It is in my heart now to make a covenant with the Lord, the God of Israel, so that his burning anger may turn away from us. My sons, don't be negligent now, for the Lord has chosen you to stand in his presence, to serve him, and to be his ministers, and to burners of incense."
So what is Hezekiah's first priority? As soon as he becomes king, he gets right to work. What's his first priority? Reopen the temple. Refocus. And so his first priority in the face of what he's dealing with, what he has to take over from, one might call that a crisis, is to call everybody to deepen their commitment to God. Refocus. And that's just a far cry from who his father was, right? So this is a look at revival. Someone who is stepping into this new role, wanting to bring about a very pure revival. So I asked the question: what can we learn about it, meaning revival, from Hezekiah's example? Well, we'll break that down. We're going to talk about a few different things that revival can do for us. Having personal revival, having maybe a large revival of some sorts. Whatever that is, we're going to talk about what that can mean for us. So the first thing I want to talk about is that revival comes through complete commitment to God. It should be our first desire in our time of pressing need. And I've said versions of this before. I understand that because we are who we are, if we go through something, sometimes our first thought isn't, let me stop and pray. Sometimes my first thought, if I'm going through something, is, let me open the script, let me open my Bible real quick and read a couple scriptures. And sometimes my first thought is just like, I have no thoughts, essentially. And whatever it is you shut down, you have emotions or whatever. And sometimes you're not thinking clearly. But if we are intent upon doing things different in our lives, showing that commitment to God, what has to be our first thought is going to God in those times of need. And those dark times, those different things that we go through, whatever it might be, whatever form those dark times take, they can help us reevaluate our dedication. I mean, I've heard it said before, and I can agree with this, that those dark times, let's just call it that, can be honestly great times for us to just recenter ourselves. Again, sometimes that's not the first place we go to. Sometimes, if I'm in the midst of a trial, I don't go, sweet, this will be a great time for me to recenter myself and to refocus. That's not the first thing that comes to my head sometimes. Depending on what it is, it can be any number of, emotions or reactions. But being in the midst of trials and struggles, it can be a fantastic way, and it should be a fantastic way for us to reevaluate ourselves, reevaluate our dedication, and just center ourselves in some way. Even though sometimes that can be hard to do. Our commitment also brings hope in those darkest of situations. Pretty similar to that first Bolden point, but more specifically, it can then bring that hope that we want. Kind of the same thing. We'll be going through a struggle or a trial. Oh, I wish there was something that would give me peace. I don't know what that is. I wish there was something. Well, I know. I mean, being able to have that spiritual maturity to evaluate our commitment to God, take time to refocus, that can bring us that hope that we're looking for. And this is true. We can become stagnant and paralyzed from fear or from lethargy or from maybe even not knowing what to do. We can stay still because of that, or we can choose to act. I think about Hezekiah here. Again, he could have, being 25 years old, having the kingdom thrust upon him, he could have just done any number of things. He could have chosen to do just what his father did because it was easy. He could have been worse. But what does he do? He breaks that mold that he should have been in, and decides to do something different. Any thoughts about this so far? Before I move on. Anything? Yes.
Well, and you have to think too. In his situation, there has to be some acceptance of what's been going on. And so he's not just making a stand to reopen the temple. He's kind of going against what has apparently become an accepted status quo that people are like, that's kind of how it is these days.
Yeah.
So, he's making a very courageous move by him.
Yeah,
He's doing a 180 basically.
none of the people he rules over are robots. It's not like, yes, we will just be fine. Like, I have to imagine there were people, obviously many, many, many people that might have an issue with this, because if they were willing to accept the temple doors being shut and idol worship to be reinstated back into the kingdom, then you can only imagine if that was tried to, if someone tried to change that, even if he was the king, there might be some opposition to that. So that's even more of a point for Hezekiah, having a lot of courage in that way. Any other questions or any other thoughts? Okay.
What motivated him to make this drastic change so immediately?
Yeah, we're not.
The first month, they were
Yeah. Yeah, we're not told what that was. But verse 2, I love the way it's simply put in verse 2. And he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father. Father David is. I like, and I love verse 3 especially. Like, it seems like it happens very suddenly, because verse 3 just says, in the first year of his reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of the house of the Lord and repaired them. Like, in the first month, in the first 4 weeks of him, 3.5, 4 weeks, whatever you want, of his reign, he says, nope, let's open those doors. It's just that fast. So that's just a huge, huge act of courage for him. Something else I wanted to point out is commitment to God also is shown through our commitment to his word. Yeah. Tommy, did you have something else you wanted to say? Oh, I thought you were. Commitment to his word. And this is just something we've already been talking about. But in Hezekiah's case, our commitment to God's laws may go against everything that we know, everything that we're comfortable with, everything that we've heard. We may have grown up in a certain way. We may have, lived our whole lives thinking a certain thing, about faith, about spirituality, about God, about something. And committing ourselves to God's word, the things that are in God's word, may make us have to reevaluate where we stand on certain things. And I can only imagine that was how it was for many, 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 many of the people. Does that make sense? Again, just because it would be hard. I have to think of myself personally. It would be hard to go against things that I've grown up, especially that my family had done, having to do things differently than my family had done, especially in such a large scale that Hezekiah had to do for his whole kingdom. That's difficult to do, Yeah.
It says, I was thinking about how Christ has changed so quick. It says his mother was Abijah, the daughter of Zechariah. I don't know, don't know for sure, but Zechariah was the name of one of the priests prior to this. So I don't know. Maybe there was some godly influence in his life that kept him anchored or something. I don't know.
Yeah. We don't know, but I just think it's a cool example of again, we hear stories all the time of people with terrible, I can think of my job as a teacher, and I have some students that come into my classroom, and sometimes you don't ask for it, but they just tell you stories about their home lives that they come from, and sometimes I'm like, oh wow, thanks for. I just want you to tell me what an adjective is. To be quite honest, I don't need your whole life story. But they'll just tell you things when you least expect it about their home lives. And I've had some students tell me before, I don't want to be like my dad, or I don't want to be like my mom, And I again, sometimes I'm just like, okay, because again, we're in the middle of writing a paper. Thank you for telling me this random thing. But sometimes I have the opportunity to be like, okay, choose not to be then. Choose not to be. Start working to not be like that. And so I see that similar sort of thing here. I wonder if Hezekiah just one day was like, you know what? I'm not going to be like my dad. I'm not going to change. I'm going to change everything about what he did because this isn't right? So I just think that's pretty cool to think about. Yeah.
Makes me think of James in chapter 4. If we know what the right thing is to do, but we don't do it, to us it's sin.
Mm-hmm.
So he knew that what his dad was doing was not right.
Right.
But he knew the right thing to do, and he chose to
Yeah.
move towards that, which is the right thing to do always.
Yeah. Chose to have a lot of courage to say, this isn't what I'm supposed to be doing. All right. Any other thoughts? Okay. So revival does more things for us. Revival comes through cleansing by God's word. And that's the key word there is cleansing. What the most important thing is, and when we're talking about revival, this is going to be something I say in different ways for the remainder of this class, is that revival, that process of revival starts at a personal level. We'll hear, especially those that have grown up in the church, have heard revival used as sort of like, let's all gather, have a revival, which I think is good. I think that's great. But revival has to start personally before it can move into a bigger space, however you want to interpret that. We've got to make sure that we are revived personally before we try to, before we try to do that in a larger scale, I should say. We've got to make sure that we're on the right track, we're focused, we have made that commitment before we try to tell others to, I suppose. So we look at our example. The temple couldn't be cleansed until personal sin was dealt with. We see Hezekiah, again, a 25-year-old kid, bust in there and said, all right, priests, nope, this is going to have to be adjusted. I mean, and just starts laying down the law in a really good way. We'll not look at that quite yet. He tells the priests, Levites, priests, in verse 5, sanctify yourselves, sanctify the house of the Lord for your fathers, and carry out the rubbish from this holy place. I mean, he's just like, get it out of here. We're going to start new. We're going to start fresh. And I just think that's, he's really taking it upon himself to deal with the sin possibly of his father, but then also the priests themselves have got to clean up everything as well. So after this, they offer 3 different sacrifices. These 3 different sacrifices do different things. So verse 21 of 29 says, and they brought 7 bulls, 7 rams, 7 lambs, and 7 male goats for a sin offering for the kingdom, for the sanctuary, and for Judah. Then he, which is Hezekiah, commanded the priests, the sons of Aaron, to offer them on the altar for the Lord. So this is a sin offering, and it shows substitution, right? So the only thing, obviously according to Old Testament law, the only thing that's going to cleanse sins is the sacrifice of bulls and goats, right? It's that thing that we've heard before. So this was an offering that was done in order to get rid of that sin, right? In order to get rid of that sin, in order to, the blood of the bulls and whatnot was the substitute for, obviously, what should be them, right? So then there's verse 27, just that first part of verse 27. Then Hezekiah commanded them to offer burnt offering on the altar. So that burnt offering shows dedication. This shows dedication to what should be their new focus, what should be their new way of life. And then finally in verse 31, then Hezekiah answered and said, now that you have consecrated yourselves to the Lord, come near and bring sacrifices and thank offerings into the house of the Lord. So the assembly brought in sacrifices and thank offerings, and as many as were of a willing heart brought burnt offerings. So a thank offering evoked devotion, thankfulness. These 3 different sacrifices are different looks at where those people are now. Any thoughts about this before we move on? Yeah, these 3 offerings exemplify complete cleansing.
Well, you can see from his leadership that he knew where to start. He told them, sanctify yourselves first. That the priests, he knew the priests had to be clean, or none of the other things would technically work the way they're supposed to work.
Right.
I mean, he knows what he's supposed to, and he knows where they're supposed to be going with this.
Right. And, I think this is maybe kind of a silly thing to think, but, Hezekiah was obviously a pretty smart guy, obviously knew the law well, in order to be like, hey, wait a minute, in order to make things right, I've got to do these different things, so let's get in there and do them, right? The only way he was going to know that is if he studied the law that he was supposed to be knowing. And I think, again, maybe this is kind of, duh, of course, but I think the same thing can be said about us. How are we going to know what the right thing is that we're supposed to do? How we're going to really bring about that cleansing for ourselves if we don't read about what that is? Again, kind of a no-brainer sort of thing to think about, but the only way Hezekiah knew how to bring about that cleansing, how to bring about that, again, revival, was if he read the law that he was supposed to read. So, again, any thoughts for him? Yeah.
Is that what Ezra did when he wrote the book?
Oh, yeah.
Weren't certain,
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Oh, yeah. Ezra, Nehemiah, those 2. So a third thing is that revival expresses itself through celebration. I thought this was kind of a cool idea. Revival expresses itself through celebration. And we'll talk about what that means. So have someone read just those 6 verses, 25 through 30 of chapter 29, and then I'll read 35 and 36. So if someone was to grab 25 through 30 really quickly, and then we'll move on from that.
He then stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, with harps, and with lyres, according to the command of David and of Gad, the king's seer, and of Nathan the prophet, for the command was from the Lord through his prophets. The Levites stood with the musical instruments of David, and the priests with the trumpets. Then Hezekiah gave the order to offer the burnt offering on the altar. When the burnt offering began, the song to the Lord also began with the trumpets, accompanied by the instruments of David, king of Israel. While the whole assembly worshipped, the singers also sang, and the trumpet sounded. All this continued until the burnt offering was finished. Now at the completion of the burnt offerings, the king and all who were present with him bowed down and worshiped. Moreover, King Hezekiah and the officials ordered the Levites to sing praises to the Lord with the words of David and Asaph the seer. So they sang praises with joy and bowed down and worshiped.
All right. And then verses 30, thank you very much, 35 and 36 says, also the burnt offerings were in abundance with the fat of the peace offerings and with the drink offerings for every burnt offering. So the service of the house of the Lord was set in order. Then Hezekiah and all the people rejoiced that God had prepared the people since the events took place so suddenly. So they are celebrating. After they have these sacrifices of cleansing, after they have probably some not so fun realizations about themselves. I mean, I can only imagine that partaking in these sacrifices, it wasn't like, well, you know how it goes. They had these. I'm sure they had to go through lots of, wow, we really messed up. And of course, Hezekiah coming in and laying down the law like that probably didn't make him feel too good. So they go through all this, again, cleansing. They go through all this, contrition, honestly. And then what do? They celebrate. So their hearts were truly in it. Did somebody say this? I thought I heard something. Okay. Their hearts were truly in it. But their celebration is also reverent. They bow their heads down and worship. They bow their heads down and worship. Yes, they're singing praises with gladness. But again, it says they bowed their heads and worshipped. And this is something that I think is also important too. I have up there, this mindset is a deliberate choice, not something that happens to us. In terms of just worship, you hear often, well, I didn't get anything out of that. Well, what did you put into it? Again, we might not always be singing our favorite songs or hear, the message that was really, that, meant something to us. But at the same time, this idea of having joy in our worship is something that is completely up to us. It really is. It's a mindset, again, and it's not to say that, every time we come into worship, all of our problems go away, or, a magic spell falls upon us and we're suddenly completely different, or like robots, a switch flips in our head and we're just like, yeah. Sometimes it's just not how it goes sometimes. Sometimes we have to realize that we are still people and we won't have great days. And sometimes it's a little harder for us to show that joy, to show that celebration like we know that we can and should. All that to say, though, that how we worship, the way in which we personally worship is, in terms of our mindset and in terms of our emotions and whatnot, that's up to us. It really is. In verse 30, it said they sing praises with joy. Do we worship with joy? Why or why not? That's a question I'm asking you. Do we worship with joy? If we do, in what ways? And if we don't, why not? Why aren't we? Sometimes this could be kind of tricky. Yeah.
Well, I think you've nailed it already, Blake, because I think about the outward part of when I smile, it lets everybody around me know I'm having a
Sure.
good day. And I've never quite understood that. As Christians, we should be smiling on a regular basis. Well, you take that internally speaking, if our heart isn't smiling when we're worshiping
Yeah.
you here for me, or are you here for some other reason?
Right.
And so you mentioned that as it relates to what did I get out of that? Well, back to that, what did I go into it with the right attitude?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else? Yeah, I think, worshiping with joy is sometimes, I don't want to say it's a tricky subject. I mean, I guess it could be in some ways, but, it's not about worshiping with joy is not about how can I just, because again, you don't want to make it about you. I don't really know how to say this very well, apparently, obviously, but you don't want to make it about you in terms look how, because it's not like a contest, I guess I should say. It's not a contest to see who's more joyful, because we're supposed to be together. We're supposed to be communing together when we worship. It's supposed to be, again, we've heard it's horizontal and it's vertical. We've heard it's those two relationships. It's not a contest to see who's more joyful. It's I'm going to do this act, which shows, hey, I'm more joyful than that guy. Look how much more impressive I am. That's not what it is. But again, John, just like you were saying, we've got to be able to, at least once we realize why we're there, why we're even able to be here in the first place, why we're even able to gather together, that should bring some measure of joy. And maybe sometimes that's just something that's lost on us. Maybe that's something we just don't think about enough. Yeah.
I think of that when we know that God's ways are not our ways. I think as humans it's challenging because if you think about the joy, we don't see joy on the cross.
No.
The result of what happened on the cross
Brings,
is
yeah.
the joy. So it's kind of hard sometimes to think that way because
Yeah.
if we're focused eternally, then our joy should be in the fact that that did occur. But when we look at what happened to make it occur, that's challenging.
Right. And I think of, every time if we have, when we go through the Lord's Supper, I think in many ways that should be a somber thing because we think, Jesus did something for me that should be me. It should have been us on the cross. It should be us dying because of what we've done. And so in that way, something like the Lord's Supper can be, that's just where my mind goes to first. Something like that can be kind of a somber thing. But when we think about what that means for us now, all that should be bringing us just tons and tons of joy. Again, not this sort of loud, let me one-up you with joy or something, but a real deep, internal, long-lasting joy. Again, nothing superficial. Again, it's that whole, something you've heard since you were young, the difference between joy and happiness, right? Happiness can be fleeting, happiness can fade, but joy is something that is more long-lasting. Yeah, Dana?
When we think of it on a personal level, we know when there's times in our lives where we're on the down slope.
Yeah, yeah.
And when we come out of that, think of the refreshing that you get.
Right.
How you feel from that. And that's what they're experiencing on a nationwide level. They're saying that people came with so many sacrifices, they didn't have the priests there to handle it all.
Right.
So he's tapped into the mindset of a lot of these people, I think, who really knew they were not doing what
Right.
they should have been. They're offering sacrifices to the bronze snake that Moses gave. That's how far they've gotten
Right.
off track.
Right, and I should have touched on this further, but I should have had another point, but and I know I mentioned it a little bit, but if you are in that position, you, kind of what you just said, you get called out in a nationwide way. All of you have not been doing the right thing, and then I can't imagine, man. No, I'm sure they probably felt really bad. And again, there was probably, nationwide contrition, I can't imagine they felt good about the way they've been living. But what's more important, because of how it finishes, is they finish with joy. Again, reverence, but joy and worship and celebration. I think that's important to know. Oh, cool, that's matching up perfectly. So, just some closing thoughts here. So, spiritual revival begins in our hearts. I mean, it really does. It begins at a personal level. Just like how it does in our example. We've got to make sure that we are doing what's right with God first. Again, it's that whole take the log out of your own eye before you try to get that speck out of your brother's eye. I mean, we've got to make sure that our hearts are right with God. We've got to make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, that we have a personal revival before we can really do anything else. So if we want that spiritual revival, if we want that change, again, we talked about at the beginning, revival only happens because we realize that something isn't working. Again, whether spiritually, it can be any number of things, whether spiritual, physical, whatever it is. Something isn't going right. Something isn't working. Something isn't well. And we have that revival to fix it, to make it better, to get it working again. So if we want that revival that we know we need to have, we must commit ourselves completely to God, just like that first point was. It can't be, just like with Hezekiah's example, it takes lots of change. You start new, you start fresh, and you keep it that way. You keep it that way. We must completely commit ourselves to God. We got to cleanse ourselves of the things that hold us back. And that can be really tricky to do. Again, we talked about how it could not have been easy for even Hezekiah to go against what he knew and to do something different. So we got to cleanse ourselves of the things that hold us back and then join together in celebration of God's grace that we all get to receive. So that's really all I have. Again, this revival process is not a easy process sometimes, but when we do it, we see how much we're given, and I think that is something that we should definitely be celebrating. Anything else? Okay, all right, we're good.